Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the more than 500 people who have registered to join us for today's special high-level event on special drawing rights. It's wonderful to have all of you with us today, as well as to have this truly incredible group of panelists to go deep in the issues of special drawing rights, pandemic response, and global economic recovery. It's very important at this time as we look at the most recent International Monetary Fund reports that we need to understand that most excuse me, sound.
We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. We got a note that we weren't coming through. So it sounds like everyone can hear us. Again, so thank you. According to the most recent IMF reports, most countries around the world are going to face worse challenges and be worse off post-pandemic than the majority of countries. At this time, only a few countries are looking to face any type of economic recovery. And among those countries, with the challenges of the virus mutating, the lack of global vaccines, we know that all countries are forecasted to deal with additional economic challenges and shocks in the years to come. This morning, the International Monetary Fund released a report, and Kristalina Georgieva, speaking to the G20 and the European Commission in a summit, noted that if the world was to move forward different aid flows like special drawing rights to move forward vaccinations, it would mean a speedier economic recovery as well as an additional $9 trillion in global economic gains by 2025. But the forecasts, as dreary as they are, the numbers are even worse. Over the last year, we've seen 495 million jobs entirely wiped out. We know that 265 million new people around the world are experiencing famine, mostly in developing middle-income countries. And according to the World Bank, 95 million people, mostly women and children, have entered the ranks of extreme poverty. So this gathering today, where we're talking about the need for global economic recovery, special drawing rights is one of the particular proposals that world leaders, civil society, academics, and others have continued to push over the last year. Civil society has called for a $3 trillion new creation of these special drawing rights, which right away, if created, would deliver $1 trillion to low-income and middle-income developing countries. At this point, there is a consensus moving forward among the IMF, G20, other world agencies, and leaders to create $650 billion in new special drawing rights. A vote for this by the International Monetary Fund could move this forward by the very end of this summer, making available out of 650 billion, 224 billion right away to low-income and middle-income developing countries. There are proposals on the table to allocate up to the additional 400 billion in special drawing rights that countries could be reallocated, 400 billion that wealthy countries will receive. And today, some of the panelists will get into some of the proposals and the thinking. Of that money, we believe it's absolutely critical that all of it be redonated to developing countries, especially in light that we're looking at a smaller creation of special drawing rights, at least this year in the short term. You'll hear today from panelists who are discussing some of the recycling or reallocation processes, which include processes which have already happened to accept these emergency special reserves, these special drawing rights, like the Poverty Growth Reduction Trust, the PGRT, which is highly concessional aid lending and at times grants to developing countries. There's always also conversation highlighted again by today's speech made by the IMF Managing Director, that there are conversations about special drawing rights being reallocated for vaccine distribution, as well as conversations on mechanisms to fight climate change and also to provide debt relief. We'll hear more about this today in today's event. And as we kick off, we want to acknowledge all of the groups and organizations that have organized today's event, leading to 500 viewers from around the world. In terms of the co-sponsors and hosts beyond Jubilee USA Network, we're excited that the following organizations have helped to make today's event possible. Action Aid International, the Africa Forum and Network on Debt and Development, the Bretton Woods Project, the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, United Kingdom, Center for Economic and Policy Research, Christian Aid, European Network on Debt and Development, the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, the Global Policy Forum, Jubilee Debt Campaign, United Kingdom, Latin American Network for Economic and Social Rights, Oxfam International, Social Justice and Global Development, Society for International Development, Third World Network, World Social Thematic Forums on Migration and on Transforming Economies, the Pan-Amazonian Forum on Health and Social Security. And finally, we want to give a very special thanks to the support and partnership of the Vatican's Dicastery for promoting integral human development, for helping us organize this event, and certainly lifting up the work of Aldo Cagliari from Jubilee USA and Patricia Miranda from Latin Dad, who've been working nonstop on this particular project. As we begin today, we're going to first hear from His Excellency Cardinal Peter Turkson, the Prefect of the Vatican Dicastery for promoting integral human development. We have a pre-recorded opening from His Excellency Cardinal Turkson. So let's listen to Cardinal Turkson's opening.
So honorable ministers of state, distinguished representatives of the different organizations, financial structures, I bring you all the warm greetings of the Dicastery for promoting integral human development at the Vatican. And on its behalf, we wish you a great session together, discussing this great and vital issue that affects all of us and determines how well we live and how well we can describe the well-being status of our own lives. It's always a great pleasure to have an opportunity to dialogue and to get involved in meetings like this. And so to those webinars aimed at advancing discussion on the role of special drawing rights for pandemic responses and recovery efforts, is a great moment for us. And I'd like to express my gratitude for all of the co-sponsoring organizations, including the various civil society networks committed to addressing debt and development. Already you've done the important work of bringing everyone to a common table. The COVID-19 pandemic, as you know, has exacerbated pre-pandemic economic challenges, pushed people into extreme poverty, and put pressure on overstretched governments to provide critical social services for their people. The pandemic has tragically impacted the ability of middle and low-income countries to service their sovereign debt obligations. And what was before the pandemic a matter of growing concern has now exploded into a real crisis. As Pope Francis recalled and reminded us short while in his social encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti, no one is saved alone, and thus we need to work together to help developing nations to break free from debilitating grip of debt. Special drawing rights then become a very timely, useful instrument, tool, and initiative, an important piece of this puzzle. Today, and I hope we engage in a fruitful dialogue on the potential design of such mechanisms so they can maximize benefits for all developing countries. However, my dear friends, special drawing rights are just the beginning of what is needed. If we want to truly achieve financial justice, much more needs to be done to enable developing countries to embark on an equitable COVID-19 recovery program and a just transition. The principles then of solidarity and fraternity call us all to see debt as a human problem on a global scale. And when from our point of view we talk about debt as a human problem, then we talk about not limiting ourselves to the statistics which prevent the enormity and the dimension, but to also see the people behind it affected by debt. Pope Francis's most recent address to the IMF and the World Bank in April calls us to consider sustainable practices for promoting authentic development. The Holy Father stated that public money may never be disjoined from public good, and financial markets should be underpinned by laws and regulations aimed at ensuring that they truly work for the common good. A commitment to economic, financial, and social solidarity then entails much more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. This is no time for philanthropy. This is time for serious business to enable people to recover and recover fully from such situations. So the debt crisis, as you all know, all the more so now as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, is an obstacle to integral human development. And we must not turn our eyes away from the crippling burden of unjust debt on the most vulnerable individuals, communities, and countries. This is not a time for indifference, from watching and observing things from the balcony, but a time for action, for responses that can help heal the human family. So I wish you then, on this occasion, all the best of luck, God's blessings essentially on a fruitful dialogue to help humanity weather profitably this great pandemic and help us, all of us, not to have the pandemic reduce us to indignified form of living, but have ways to enable us to continue to live sustainably in dignity. And for this, may God bless your efforts and everything that you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Cardinal Turkson, for that wonderful introduction. Now, as we begin our panel today, a few logistical announcements. The chat function is going to be open just for a few minutes longer. That's primarily for announcements or information to be shared. Soon the chat function will be closed. If you have any technical issues or technical problems, please email operations@jubileeusa.org or latindad@latindad.org. Again, if you have any technical issues, please go ahead and email latindad@latindad.org or operations@jubileeusa.org. The Q&A function is a place where you can list questions for the panelists. Although panelists will be able to see all of those questions, we do have a team of people today that are going through the questions. We'll edit the questions and combine the questions and send them to me. So during our question and answer period, I can redirect the various questions to each of our panelists today. In addition, I know that there are some questions that have been coming through on interpretation, translation. Today's event is available in English, Spanish, and French. At the bottom of the screen, you should see an interpretation link. If you click on that link, you can choose which language you would like to hear or read the event in. And that's at the interpretation link in the bottom of your screens. As I get ready to introduce this incredible group of panelists to discuss global economic recovery, pandemic response, and the use of special drawing rights, we do have a last-minute apology which has come in. Unfortunately, Ambassador Munir Akram, the ambassador from Pakistan, and His Excellency, the President of the UN Economic and Social Council, is not able to join us and has been called away for another meeting. But as much as we're going to miss Munir being with us today, we're incredibly excited about the panelists that are here. Our first panelist today will be Vera Songwe, who's the United Nations Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. She will be followed by Jose Antonio Ocampo, the former finance minister and central bank board member of Colombia. Then we'll hear from Daouda Sembene, the distinguished non-resident fellow and from the Center for Global Development and former International Monetary Fund executive director for all African countries. Then we'll hear from the International Monetary Fund's Ana Corbacho, who's the Assistant Director of Strategy, Policy, and Review at the International Monetary Fund. In that capacity, Ana is leading a lot of the exploratory work that's taking place on special drawing rights right now. Then we'll hear from Esteban Perez Caldentey, the Chief Financing for Development Unit of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And our last speaker before we move to question and answers, we're excited to have with us Jayati Ghosh, the Professor of Economics from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So I'd like to first open the floor for a 5-minute introduction, a 4 to 5 minute introduction from Vera Songwe, the UN Undersecretary General. She's going to speak with us today about how SDR allocation and SDR transfer mechanisms can be designed to maximize benefit for all countries that need help, low-income countries and developing middle-income countries, and ensuring all countries can come to the table for economic transformation through special drawing rights. Vera, I open the floor to you. Thank you so much for being with us today. I believe you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Eric. Yes, we're not yet used to unmuting and muting as part of our daily livelihoods. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Let me start by thanking Jubilee for putting this together. I think that clearly when we have the Holy See engaged in a discussion like this, we know that it's serious and that it is affecting our lives and our livelihoods. We at the Economic Commission for Africa are building upon really a lot of the work that has been led by the Secretary General, our Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who at the beginning of this crisis called for a global response to what initially and has continued to be a health and human security crisis, but for most of us, especially on the African continent, has really morphed into an economic crisis. We've done a lot of studies at the ECA that show that, in the early beginnings of the crisis, at least over 37 African countries closed their borders, the economy stopped, and we were losing about $49 billion a month because of those lockdowns. Those lockdowns, in the end, I think have helped Africa in its response because we haven't seen the kinds of dramatic consequences on the health side of the crisis as we have seen in other places. I think it raised awareness, nothing to raise awareness than to see an African market totally closed and African streets without people on them. But that's what we lived at the beginning of this crisis, sometime in April, May, July of 2020. I think that shock of the sort of imminent consequences of the crisis for the continent, you know, eventually has morphed into an economic crisis. Of course, we've lost jobs. 70% of the continent lives essentially on small and medium enterprises. This is the same for many developing countries, by the way. But what we saw is the beginnings of a disparity in the economic system. As of date, and you mentioned some of the numbers that Kristalina is putting out, and the IMF, and I must say, and I will say this later, the IMF has done an amazing job in terms of response to this crisis. But Kristalina would say that the advanced economies, you know, put a floor to almost a free fall in economic development by giving themselves, you know, stimuluses after stimulus, and to just ensure that people could live safely, that people could afford a daily meal. On the continent, you know, compared to 20% of GDP that was put in place for economic stimulus in the advanced economies, middle income economies put about 6% of stimulus, and low income economies 2%. And so you can just, I mean, the beginning of the sort of economic divergence and the divergence between saving lives and livelihood started then. Of course, today that discussion is on vaccines. 1.2 billion people have been vaccinated across the world, and on our continent, only 20 million. Again, you know, huge disparity in the response. The African Union has set up an African Vaccines Acquisition Task Team, led by Strive Masiwia, working with Afri-Exim Bank, that have put forward about $2 billion to close the gap between what COVAX will do. And COVAX is going to produce a supply about 27% of the vaccines to the continent. But we all know that to get to herd immunity, we need 60%. So the African Union initiative of AVAD, working together with Afri-Exim Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and others, is actually trying to see how do we close that gap from 27 to 60%. And happy to say that with Johnson & Johnson have just announced an agreement where we will be able to get another 220 million vaccines for the continent. That will be another 18%. And then we still need to close the 20%. And that is why when we talk about SDRs, they become very important. $650 billion of SDRs were issued. For those who don't know, SDRs are special drawing rights. SDRs, and then the IMF is on the call, SDRs are a way of you know, global printing of new money, if you want. And the world comes together and says, we need additional liquidity, let's go off and print money. These resources are printed, and then they're redistributed across countries in a quota formula that allows for different countries to have access to different percentages. Now, what we at the Economic Commission for Africa have been proposing, and the UN, is $650 billion of SDRs were issued. 283 billion of these SDRs that have been issued will go to the G7 countries. If you add China to it, then you get to 320 billion. So 8 countries in the world will get about, you know, a little bit over 60% of the SDRs that are going to be issued. Africa as a whole continent gets 33 billion. So just in terms of perspective, 283 billion to the G7, 33 billion to 54 countries on the continent. So what Africa is asking for is, can we move to a second step of the conversation, which is do some on-lending of the SDRs. So not additional granting of the SDRs, but on-lending the SDRs, which means that we will re-borrow the SDRs from countries at US Treasury bill rates, which are very low. We know that interest rates in the developed and the advanced economies are very low, so that we can do more. What is the more that we're talking about? We're essentially talking about 3 things. The first one is, if you at least on-lend 25% of the SDRs, we get about $162 billion of additional SDRs. If you do 25 to 30%, you get somewhere between 162 to 195 billion dollars of SDRs. The first thing is to replenish the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust in the IMF. And why are we saying this? Because the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust in the IMF is a facility that we saw work really well and very effectively at the beginning of this crisis to on-lend resources to low-income countries immediately to be able to stave off, economic disasters in many of these countries. So if it's a mutualized way of helping all low-income countries in an organized way and through a vehicle that has been tried and tested. The Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust was set up in 2008, 2009, after the financial crisis, when SDRs, special drawing rights, were issued, and the United States was not using all of its SDRs and came up with the idea generously that they could use this to set up a fund. Since then, that fund has grown. Now we have a second crisis, and we're building on that experience. Finish this fund to do more. The second proposal is to use some of these on-lent SDRs, 25% at least, to create a vaccines fund. We've all seen, the importance of vaccinations, but we've also seen the difficulty in having access to vaccines. I think when COVAX was set up, the donors of COVAX at the time all thought, we can get vaccines from India, Serum Institute of India, but we are all watching and our hearts go out to the Indians, and we pray for all the families and everybody across the globe, by the way, that has lost somebody to this virus, but I think particularly to India. But one of the resulting factors of what's going on in India today is that, of course, we can't get vaccines out of India, and so there is a little bit of a glut. Again, we're very thankful to the US government for having now relaxed a little bit the TRIPS waiver, and they're willing to share some licenses to have more vaccine production. It's not done yet. The WTO is still going through this, and Ghazi, who is the African leader now of the WTO, we're very proud of that. Hopefully can push that conversation, which is being backed by India and South Africa, by the way, to get more countries to be able to produce more vaccines. The problem today is about production of vaccines. We just are not producing enough to respond to the demands of everybody. But if we begin to produce enough, we will get into a problem of, can everybody afford it? And that's why we hope that, we can use some of the SDRs in a very specialized vehicle at the IMF, we hope, to be able to assist with vaccine procurement, purchase, and distribution. And finally, one of the things that has happened in this crisis is that while we have helped the G20 have come together and launched initiatives such as the debt suspension initiative, which has been, for Africa at least, $5 billion in the first round of new and additional liquidity was put into countries to be able to respond. The middle income countries, the vulnerable countries, have not gotten that much support. But they are, on our continent at least, they make up 75% of our GDP, 60% of our population, and over 45% of the poor on the continent live in middle income countries. So we cannot afford to have a response to this crisis that ignores middle income. Also proposing that we create a facility called the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, which helps, one, provide more liquidity to middle income countries, but as we begin to talk of recovery, that we create a facility that allows for green investment, green bonds. These countries have market access. Today, market access is a little bit skewed because we do have a liquidity premium on African and particularly global emerging market countries. We're working to take away that liquidity premium so that we can ensure that these countries have access to markets at comparable rates to other advanced economies that are going to the markets. So this for us is sort of, the three buckets that we're looking at: a low income bucket, the PIGT, a vaccines bucket, that's the only way we save lives and reopen our economies. And then to look at, this new and emerging Africa, which we're very proud of, which has more middle income countries, which have been a little bit forgotten, and to say, can we pay attention to them, not just in Africa, but across the world in terms of, providing additional support. The development institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, do not have enough resources. They need to be recapitalized, but markets have trillions of dollars which they can on-lend to these countries, and we need to make access to that more affordable and more sustainable. So these are the three things that we are hoping that special drawing rights will be able to be used for, and that will help us with the recovery much faster, and that it will be more sustainable. Thank you for your attention.
Vera, thank you so much. And thank you for outlining so succinctly those important three buckets: being able to support the poorest countries through the use of PRGT funds, being able to use the SDRs for immediate vaccine distribution, and of course, the really big question that continues to be on all of our minds since the onset of the pandemic, that we're seeing some of the most extreme increases in poverty, in famine and job loss in the so-called middle-income countries. And there are less solutions on the tables, and we need to be able to use special drawing rights to support developing middle-income countries as well. Our next speaker is Jose Antonio Ocampo. Jose is going to speak about some of the short-term and long-term reform proposals to improve functioning and benefits of the special drawing rights, including how we're actually looking at allocating them. It's great to have my good friend Jose Antonio Ocampo from Colombia. You're in Colombia, I understand, right now, Jose.
Yeah, you can see our landscape. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with all of you, and actually very nice to follow the presentation by Dr. Songwe from the Economic Commission for Africa. Let me perhaps, agreeing with the previous statements, including from her, let me actually emphasize the limitations that SDRs have, because they are a particular instrument with several limitations. First of all, they are essentially foreign exchange reserves. The country that receives the SDRs has to pay an interest to the IMF, and they cannot be used except for central banks and a few other international institutions. So I think those constraints have to be taken into account to see what we can do with the SDRs. The positive effect is that they generate international liquidity for developing countries in a small proportion, as Dr. Songwe said. It's a bit less than 40%, of course, including China as a developing country, which is perhaps not enough money, particularly given taking into account the very limited international cooperation that has taken place. Now, since they are an asset that for which you have to pay an interest to the IMF, donations are not easy because the country that donates SDRs will have to pay an interest to the IMF anyway. So one alternative that I have suggested is that when they are donated for social purposes or climate change mitigation or adaptation, I mean, whatever other purpose you think, then, they are donated, then the interest payments could be paid by the general IMF budget. But that has not been done. I don't know if it's legally possible from the point of view of the IMF rules. But that will be the only possible. The other is on lending, which is what Dr. Songwe already mentioned. And in that regard, of course, for low-income countries, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust is one channel, which can be amplified, as she pointed out. But also, there has to be a mechanism to channel that towards middle-income countries, for which there has been very limited cooperation during this crisis. Also for low-income countries, I think the cooperation has been limited, but for middle-income countries, it has been essentially nil, no cooperation at all. Now, because of the limitation of a special drawing rights and the fact that, according to my research on that topic, about 85% of the SDRs will remain unused by members. There are three long-term solutions that we have to start discussing in the IMF. The first one, and in my view, the most important, is to eliminate this dual accounting. According to the IMF, has an SDR accounts, and then they have the general resource accounts. Which essentially means that most of the SDRs received by countries are just accounting statements. They mean nothing else, in fact. So the best solution, in my view, is to eliminate that dual accounting and consider the SDRs issued and not used as deposits in the IMF, that the IMF then can use to finance its programs. That has been my proposal for several years, and I think it's something that could start to be discussed. It reflects also views of the IMF staff members for, in the past. The second is to change the distribution formula so that you not only take into account the quotas of IMF members, but also other factors. And in my proposal has been the demand for reserves. Since middle and low-income countries have a much larger demand for foreign exchange reserves, that element should be taken into account in the allocation of IMF quotas. And third, possibly the private use of SDRs or the use outside the current institutions which are allowed to use the SDRs, which may be a way forward to a broader use of the SDRs as international money, which was, by the way, for example, through transactions that are done online by different actors. I mean, it could be one alternative, but sort of much better than cryptocurrencies, of course, because of their stable value. But any of these three solutions will require changes in the IMF Articles of Agreement, which, of course, is a long-term issue. And in my view, the order of importance is the one I mentioned. At least eliminate the dual accounting and take and consider SDRs not used as deposits in the IMF. That's the first solution, the most important in my view. Then change the distribution formula and possibly allow for the private use. Thank you. But in any case, let me finish emphasizing this. What can be done with the SDRs is what they legally are for, which is constrained by the IMF Articles of Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose Antonio. While those particular proposals that Jose Antonio was putting forward sound technical, they are incredibly important in terms of being able to move forward SDRs in a positive way and for SDRs to reach their purpose of supporting and assisting countries in need. Our next speaker that we have with us today is Daouda Sembene. And Daouda is a distinguished non-resident fellow for the Center for Global Development and the former IMF Executive Director for African countries. He's going to speak a bit today about proposals for mechanisms for SDR reallocation with a special focus on Africa and countries being able to work together in a multilateral manner. Before Daouda begins his presentation, I just want to remind people, if you are having any technical difficulties, you can email operations@jubileeusa.org or latindad@latindad.org. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A function, and we have a team of people that are preparing those questions and comments to redirect them to panelists during the question and answer period. So let me turn it over to Daouda.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's very good to be with you and other distinguished panelists, such as my friend Vera and also Jose Antonio. I just want to correct something before I start. I was IMF ED, but for 23 African countries and not for all African countries. So I think already 23 was too much. So if I were to do it for the whole continent, I don't think I would be here with you today. But anyway, I just want to start by saying that this is a very important topic and a very timely discussion, and a topic that personally, me and other CGD colleagues have been working a lot on, how SDR allocations could be actually best used to help developing countries cope with the current crisis. And certainly in my previous publication and also in the publication by CGD in general, we very much welcome, of course, the upcoming 650 billion SDR issuance that the IMF is poised to make by the end of this year. Certainly, it took a long time to come, but better late than never. And certainly, this is something that is going to provide much needed additional liquidity to developing countries so that they can fight the pandemic and launch a sustainable and inclusive recovery process. The paradox with SDR allocations is that they benefit primarily countries that need them the least during a crisis. As you know, since SDR are allocated in proportion of quota shares, you have this outcome that Vera has talked about earlier in her remarks, that the fact that we will see actually advanced economies receiving most of the SDRs. Vera talked about the G7. If I talk to you about the G20, G20 overall will receive over 2/3 of the allocations, about 443 billion. And by contrast, you will see that the low-income countries are going to receive only 21 billion out of the 650 billion, which is not, of course, this is certainly going to be helpful in many of those countries to address the impact of the crisis. But certainly, if you look at it and put it in perspective, this is certainly not that much. When you look at Africa specifically, what you see is actually, of course, you have Africa that will be allocated 33 billion out of those 650 billion. And as I said earlier, this is going to be much needed additional liquidity for crisis-related spending. It's going to certainly help many African governments actually acquire vaccines, but also be able to spend more to respond to the crisis. But what you will see also is, even within Africa, there is going to be an equal distribution of SDRs. You have 7 countries in Africa that will claim over half of the SDRs. And you will see actually the rest of the African countries, the 47 other countries actually getting the rest. And among those 47, you see 23 African low-income countries that are going to receive only $6.5 billion out of the 600. So they're going to receive 1% of the whole SDR allocation. So that's certainly extremely helpful for many of them as they are facing limited buffers right now to respond to the crisis. But you will see that actually the allocation to the low-income countries is going to be almost half of African countries will only receive 20% of allocations to Africa. So what I also wanted to point out is, if you look at it also, these allocations to Africa are relatively limited or small when you look at their all additional financing need. If I refer to the IMF latest publication, I think it is estimated that Africa financing gap is about 285 billion. And this is only to counter the effect of COVID-related shocks. If you talk about adding actually resources for recovery, then you're talking about maybe more double than this amount. So just to say that you have to put this in perspective. But that being said, I think actually what the G20 has been communicating recently is very much welcome. The fact that actually they would be working on reallocating excess SDRs so that it can benefit most vulnerable countries. And certainly, we certainly think that institutions like the Jubilee and other co-hosts of this event actually have a key role to play to make sure that we maximize this reallocation. So I think one question that you ask us is actually how we can make sure that these SDR transfer mechanisms are designed to maximize the impact for all countries that need support. I think here how to proceed is going to depend on the purpose and the size of the SDR reallocations. So when we talk about the purpose, whether SDR resources are going to be used for health security, like vaccine purchase, as Vera talked about, or debt sustainability, or other objective related to climate protection, will have implications for which transfer mechanism would be most appropriate, and which institution should manage them. Now, so at this juncture, I think everyone would agree a key priority is to fight the impact of the health crisis. So a key priority would be to improve vaccine access for Africa and other developing countries around the world. But there are some other priorities that should not be forgotten. If you talked about Africa, other priorities include, of course, making sure that government do have resources to bolster economic recovery so that they can create more jobs. They can also fight inequality, income inequality and wealth inequality. And they can also actually make sure that they address poverty increases that we have seen since the onset of the crisis. I think the institution like the World Bank had estimated that millions, tens of millions of people are now getting poorer as a result of the crisis. So African governments and government in developing countries in general need additional resources so that they can give additional comfort and relief for those people who are affected. One other area where resources are needed, is including those that will be collected from SDR allocations, is debt. How you make sure that you can reduce the burden of debt that many countries are bearing right now in Africa and around the world in developing countries. And one issue that should not be also forgotten is many of those countries, the reason why they also having more debt is not only because they're responding to the health crisis, but they also responding to the security tensions that they are actually facing. And so long as we don't find a solution to the security issues that they're facing, chances are they're going to be actually having more and more actually debt-related issues. Not to say that, of course, that security is the only reason why debt has been growing lately. So on the size of the reallocation that I talked about, I think if we have a size that is very limited, so I think there is no point for talking about what transfer mechanism should be actually there, because chances would be that IMF members would just agree to replenish the PRGT, which is the concessional window of the IMF. But if we do talk about actually sizable reallocations, then there are many other options. Of course, I'm not going to talk about the on-lending via the IMF PRGT. Vera and Jose Antonio has already talked about that, so no need to talk about that. Theoretically, there is a possibility for the IMF to create another window that would be actually addressing specific purpose that would be attributed or objective that would be assigned to this reallocation. The issue with that is, of course, that you have to abide by the IMF rules as indicated in the Article of Agreement. You have to make sure, of course, that whatever you do with that trust has to be consistent with the IMF Article of Agreement. It also has to comply with the so-called uniformity of treatment principle, etc. And that's certainly quite complicated. So one additional transfer mechanism that should be on the table is actually one on-lending mechanism via a special purpose fund outside the funds. And if you were to do that, there are two possibilities. The first one is to create a new fund outside the IMF and make it a so-called prescribed holder of SDR. Prescribed holders of SDR are those institutions that are authorized to handle SDRs. The private sector cannot do it. Individual cannot do it. You have to be a prescribed holder to do it. And there are 15 such prescribed holders around the world, including, of course, IDA at the World Bank, EBRD, including the African Development Bank, the ECB, some central bank in Africa, including BCAO and BR, etc. So you have to actually find a way to task one of those prescribed holders, if you want to go fast, to actually on-lend. Now, it doesn't mean that any institution, existing institution that is not a prescribed holder should not be also receiving those SDR. They can find a way to, of course, do it through those prescribed holders, or actually to be getting that title of prescribed holders. So one last thing that I would say is actually here, I think one of the issues that we are discussing today is whether there would be a role for global, regional, and sub-regional development banks in the mechanism. My guess is ideally, yes, there should be a role, but that role depends once again on the scope of the reallocation. If the reallocation is limited, like I said earlier, reallocated SDR might just be enough to replenish PRGT resources. And one last thing that I would want to say is, of course, that if, of course, we are in the fortunate situation where large shareholders of the IMF agree to reallocate significant amount of their SDR, then we can actually find ways to use those existing institutions at the regional and multilateral level to use the SDR appropriately. One thing that I certainly think is going to be important is that for reallocated SDR to be most effective, we should find a way to leverage those SDR. Not necessarily actually use them in one short ways, but find a way that even if you were to reallocate them to the World Bank or AFDB, or maybe actually even some regional development bank like BORD in West Africa or somewhere in Latin America, you find a way that to have mechanisms that allow you to leverage the most of these SDR so that they can actually have more additional effect than just the original amount that would be allocated. So that's where I wanted to stay at this stage, and I look forward to the questions.
Great, thank you so much, Daouda. Some very important points. We really need to be focused on a sizable reallocation if we're serious, both in terms of impact as well as being able to recycle the needed SDRs to developing low-income and middle-income countries. Also, a very important reminder that we need to look at processes, mechanisms, and institutions that can receive special drawing rights beyond the International Monetary Fund. While the International Monetary Fund will be a very important place for recycling, we know that it's not the only vehicle or way that recycling can take place for the special drawing rights. And on that note, we're incredibly excited to have with us today Ana Corbacho. Ana is doing a lot of incredible work at the IMF in terms of looking at these recycling mechanisms and exploring the overall work in terms of moving forward special drawing rights. She'll speak a little bit today on SDR allocation and the development of transfer mechanisms in the current moment. Ana, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's really great to be part of this panel, and I thank colleagues and friends who have spoken before me, and I really appreciate that many of them referred, in fact, to the Articles of Agreement of the IMF. What I would like to do today is a little bit go back to the basics as to what is feasible within our current framework and what would take much more time. We are in the midst of health emergency, a devastating economic crisis, so a speedy response is of the essence, and this is why some of the proposals we're considering have that into consideration. So let me start with the very basics on what the SDR instrument is. I think it was Jose who highlighted it is an international reserve asset. It is not money. We do not issue money. We are not a central bank. The IMF is not a central bank. What the SDR does is give members, these are resources that go to countries, a potential claim on hard currencies of other IMF members. And it is a closed system. Once the allocation takes place of SDRs, if countries hold the same amount of SDRs as their allocation, the only impact in their balance sheets and in their economies is a boost to international reserves. And this is really a fundamental and potential big benefit during the crisis, because we know how important it is for all countries to have sufficient liquidity buffers. So that's the first thing that would happen when the allocation takes place. We're working on a historic allocation proposal of $650 billion. Why this size? The size has to be cognizant of what is a long-term need to supplement existing reserve assets. This is by the Articles of Agreement of the IMF. So what we first have to do technically is to demonstrate there is a long-term global need to supplement existing reserve assets and how the SDR allocation can help supplement or meet that global reserve need. That's the technical work we have done, and we're ready to go to the board now at the end of June. The second big condition is that we need broad support from the members. So this allocation can only take place and become effective once the Board of Governors gives approval with an 85% voting majority. These are big benchmarks, but it can happen relatively quickly. We're talking a matter of months if the support from the board and the Board of Governors is secured in terms of from now until the allocation is in the hands of members. By the articles also, the distribution of the allocation is in proportion to IMF quota shares. And there's been a lot of discussion earlier about possible ways to change that. It's very difficult to change it in a fast way. So we're going to allocate, per the articles of agreement, the allocation in proportion to IMF quota shares. And this entails that the emerging markets and developing countries will receive about 42% of the total, and this is $274 billion. I understand the call for that to be higher, but let's be, again, pitching on the merits of this sizable injection of liquidity. It's still a very, very large amount. For low-income countries, the size of the allocation would be $21 billion. It's a small share, but this is comparable in size to all the new PRTT financing that has been granted to low-income countries throughout the COVID pandemic. So it's still, again, a sizable direct effect that will benefit countries that are needed. There's also the global benefit of boosting confidence, boosting resilience, and sending this powerful multilateral response to the COVID-19 crisis that can also help stabilize global financial stability and help all member countries. Now, what can countries do when they receive the SDRs? First thing they can do is use them to build up reserve buffers. And again, this is a critical benefit, particularly when we think about a divergent recovery that many of the panelists have reference to. When advanced economies may be advancing in the recovery stage faster than developing countries. So having financial buffers can be very important for developing countries to boost their resilience and be able to respond if there were to be bouts of global financial volatility. The SDR can also free the use of other liquid reserves. So even if countries hold the SDRs, they can use other liquid reserves for critical balance of payment needs. And countries are also free to exchange the SDR for hard currency. Now, when that takes place, the allocation would remain the same, but the holdings of SDRs would go down. So countries face an interest charge on the difference. Let me clarify, this is not interest that is paid to the IMF, it's paid to the SDR department, which is separate from the IMF general resource account. Again, because SDRs are member resources, in contrast to quotas, which are IMF resources and are used to finance our programs. The interest rate right now is very low. It's 0.05%. So this is still very affordable use of SDRs, but we have to be cognizant that the interest rate is a variable interest rate. So again, if advanced economies start to normalize their monetary conditions and unwind the really sizable injection of stimulus that they've done during the crisis, we could foresee that interest rates will rise in the coming years. And therefore, it's important for countries to consider the opportunity cost of using SDRs vis-a-vis other liquid reserves. So this is on the merits of the general allocation. It has to be consistent with the articles of agreement. It needs very broad support, but we're confident that we would be able to secure the process so that the $650 billion will become effective, hopefully, by the end of the summer. What the allocation also opens is the possibility for countries that have strong external positions and do not need to boost their external resilience and build up their buffers to channel part of their holdings for the more vulnerable countries. So that's the big debate that we're taking on today. 4 very important considerations when we think about channeling options. Number 1, it can only happen on a voluntary basis. Again, SDRs are member reserves. So we need willing creditor countries to either donate or lend their SDRs, and that can happen on a voluntary basis and according also to domestic institutional and legal restrictions that lenders face. In terms of considering donations or lending, again, if a lender country or a strong country decides to lower their holdings and transfer part of their SDRs to other countries, they would face an interest charge. And if it's a donation, meaning it's a permanent transfer of their holding, they would face that interest cost forever. So for many donor countries, what makes more sense is to think about donations through the regular budget process rather than through using SDRs. So we haven't seen instances of donations of SDRs. Lending SDRs would be a different modality, and the expectation would be that all lent SDRs would be repaid. Now, when that happens, the credit country also faces credit risks. Finally, the fourth consideration is that in many countries, once the SDRs are lent, they're not considered reserve assets anymore, because the quality of that asset is now different. It's instead of a reserve asset, it becomes a claim or a loan. So these are four issues that all lender countries, credit countries would face. The one modality that has resolved those issues is the PRGT. And this has come up as clearly a proven, already tested mechanism for channeling SDRs. And it's one of the main options under consideration to scale up the concessional financing capacity of the IMF. The second bucket is thinking about channeling SDR for specific purposes, for health preparedness, vaccines, climate resilience, debt issues. The way this could take place is through another trust that may need similar features to the PRGT to find willing creditors. And it also, as Daouda said, it needs to satisfy that it's additional to other IMF tools and it's complementary. Right now, in terms of our lending capacity, the general resource accounts, which is available to all IMF member countries, has ample lending capacity. So we would need to consider why we need an extra trust that would satisfy perhaps a different purpose or a gap for that to be feasible for us. Final bucket could be to think about a trust rather than in the IMF, in a multilateral development bank or other prescribed holders. Again, for lenders, some of them have specific restrictions that they need to think about in terms of being able to on-lend SDRs to a trust that is not placed in the IMF. So let me conclude. The general SDR allocation proposal is a historic, sizable benefit that would go to all member countries and would help the global recovery, and in particular for countries that are right now facing severe liquidity constraints. Channeling gives us the opportunity to double up on the benefits of the general allocation, but we need to make sure that we satisfy the needs also of the creditor countries, because they would by design face certain risks and certain costs that they need to be taken care of within their domestic institutions. I stop here and I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Anna, thank you so very much. And also thank you very much for sharing with us some of the thresholds and processes that are moving forward right now, as well as several of the technical considerations inside the International Monetary Fund as we discuss special drawing rights. Our next speaker is Esteban Perez. Esteban is the chief of the Financing for Development Unit of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. He'll be talking today specifically on ECLAC's focus on special drawing right recycling mechanisms and how best we can use these to bolster financing needs in Latin America and the Caribbean. Esteban, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I would like to thank on my behalf and that of the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, Alicia Bárcena, Latindad, and Patricia Miranda for the invitation. As probably you know, Latin America has been the region most impacted by the pandemic. The rate of growth contracted by -7.7% in 2020, investment contracted by minus 20% in real terms. There has been a huge increase in poverty from 185 to 209 million people. Extreme poverty has been up by 8 million people. The governments have responded to the pandemic with an important effort, representing 4.6% of GDP on average for Latin American countries, with the result that the fiscal accounts, which were in deficit of minus 3% in 2019, have furthered their deficit to minus 6.9% in 2020, and that has increased from 45.6% of GDP on average to 56.3%. Latin America is at a regional level the region that has the highest debt service in terms of exports of goods and service, 59%. And the interest costs are high in general for developing economies relative to developed economies. So we have this problem of the negative effects of the pandemic, social and economics, closure of the fiscal space. So there's certainly a need for thinking about how to increase liquidity, how to recycle liquidity from developed to developing countries, and how also to think about debt solutions for developing countries, including Latin American middle-income countries, such as those of Latin America and the Caribbean. SDRs are one way to recycle liquidity from developed countries to developing countries. The SDR, as we know, has not become what it was designed for, to be the principal reserve asset of the international monetary system, but it has significant advantages. It's automatic. It does not generate additional debt. And I was pointed before, it pays the rate of interest, but right now the rates of interest are very, very low. Those are charged on allocations, 0.05%, which can help countries, some countries, reduce their risk premium. We know, as it has been mentioned, that the existing quota system implies that the developed countries get the bulk of any SDR allocation. Our computations amount to 64.4%. The distribution of the 650 US billion equivalent of SDRs, the majority, 418 billion, will go to developed countries. And as has been said before, 33 billion will go to Africa. Western Asia will receive 33.7, East Asia and the Pacific 39.3, China 41.7, Central and South Asia 31.6, and Latin America 51.5 billion. One can compare to have a standard to what Latin America receives as emergency lending from the IMF, 68 billion. But that includes flexible credit lines, which have not been activated. If we take out, Latin America is receiving currently, or has received up until now, 22.4 billion. So at least the allocation of SDRs would be about more than twice what it's receiving today. The fact that the developed countries will receive the bulk of an SDR allocation is obviously a negative feature of the way the quota system is designed. But one needs to try to measure the allocation of SDR in terms of the function for which the SDR was created as a reserve asset. So we think that it's important to take a look at what would the allocation represent in terms of international reserves for middle-income countries and for Latin America and the Caribbean countries. In the case of Latin America, the contribution of a new issue of 650 billion of this proposal as a percentage of international reserve would vary according to countries. There's a wide disparity of countries. It would range from about 70 or 80% in the case of Venezuela to 3% in the case of Peru. However, a more detailed analysis shows that a new allocation would benefit some of the smaller economies in the region, the small island developing states, which are also the more vulnerable to structural constraint and exposure to natural hazards. Guyana and Suriname would be among the most benefited, and they would receive about the allocation of SDRs in terms of reserve, which represent 37 and 30% of their international reserves. And other economies such as El Salvador, Belize, Haiti, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Ecuador, and St. Lucia would also benefit. And some of these, Belize, Jamaica, and Suriname, which would get 20, 17, and 30% the equivalent of international reserve, are also among the most indebted economies. So this would be an important positive feature of the allocation. The other feature of the other issue that is relevant to this context relates to the linkage between SDRs and development. Not only SDRs as a instrument of financial stability, but how can we link SDR and development? We know that the new issue will not be enough, although it would certainly contribute to financial stability. It will not be enough to meet the financial needs. There is a need for reallocation from developed to developing countries, and there are precedents going back to the financial crisis of 2009. Reallocation has an empirical foundation. And one empirical foundation that could be a baseline is the rate of utilization of SDRs by developed and by developing countries, which may be a measure of the need for reserves. We know from calculations that the rate of utilization of developed countries on average is about 9 or 8%, whereas much larger for developing economies. The modalities for reallocation have been already mentioned. One is to boost the Poverty and Growth Trust Fund, which, as we know, has mobilized resources up to date that amount to 24 billion, of which 2/3 or 15 billion are from the use of existing SDRs. But the PRGT, although it may include some vulnerable middle-income countries, small island developing states, it's basically targeted to low-income countries, does not include middle-income countries. And it's important in any reallocation proposal to include middle-income countries because of their importance, not only in population, but also in terms of the demand, investment, and also because they hold the bulk of the debt of developing countries for also financial stability purposes. So it is necessary either to expand the Poverty and Growth Trust Fund to include middle-income countries or create a new trust fund, as was mentioned before, to support middle-income countries in their response and their recovery efforts. I think also, and this I think was mentioned before, the reallocation should also be used as a way to boost the lending capacity of regional financial institutions and regional development banks. As we know, there are 15 institutions that are prescribed holders. In Latin America, there are 2 such institutions, the FLAR and the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. If other regional development banks were to be part of these reallocation mechanisms, we would have to find some other vehicle so they could perhaps issue some type of security, and which could be bought by currency that comes out of unused SDRs, and which could be then used for concessional finance or development finance. Finally, there's the issue of donation of SDRs for global public goods. When we think about the modalities for reallocation, I think we should go back to the type of schemes and frameworks that were proposed for climate finance in 2009 using SDRs, whether to use the SDRs as to obtain currency or to use the SDRs as capital in order to leverage some funds and in order obviously to provide funding for developing countries. Now the issue, and with this
Esteban,
I
if we
finish.
can wrap up, please. Thank
Yes.
you.
The last issue I want to mention is that the SDRs, the issue reallocation, are not enough. The SDRs are not a panacea. They will not solve the entire liquidity problem, nor that problem of the Caribbean. And this should be accompanied by other proposals that include they should be part of a broader strategy to redistribute liquidity, strengthen regional cooperation, the institutional reform of the multilateral architecture, and also think about how liquidity and strategies to reduce the debt must be part of a financing for development strategy to build forward better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esteban. And thank you for highlighting the impact of SDRs as well as the need in Latin America and expanding them to middle-income countries. Our final speaker, we're incredibly happy to have with us Jayati Ghosh today, who's going to speak about recycling mechanisms to support public health. As she's speaking, I would invite all speakers to think about their closing comment. Each speaker will have about a minute. We will review some questions, but please feel free to look at questions in the Q&A function if there's one that you want to respond to. Jayati.
Thank you very much. This has been an incredibly illuminating discussion. I feel privileged to be part of this. I want to just pick up on some of the points that were already made by Jose Antonio and by Anna. Just to remind everyone, SDRs are only reserve assets. They are not money in the sense that people normally think of it. Therefore, the repurposing has to be, as Anna mentioned again, voluntary and national. And medium-term solutions will necessarily take time, including new funds. In that context, I want to make a few points. First, what do we do right now? What do we do with the immediate allocation that is going to take place of $650 billion? And certainly there have been many discussions of what G7 can do. I think it is very important to emphasize that in the middle of this global public health emergency, one of the immediate uses that could be put by G7 of the SDRs that they would be getting is to put some of this money into the WHO's ACT accelerator, which includes, of course, vaccines, but not just vaccines. It also covers therapeutics, diagnostics, health systems connector, etc. So in other words, the entire range of financing that is required right now to deal with the pandemic, the accelerator at the moment has about $22 billion financing gap. 10% of the G7 allocation is more than enough to cover that gap immediately. Now, if I'm saying that this is not really money, then what is the point of doing this? Well, let me be completely frank and honest here. The only point is that the budgetary implication for these G7 countries is minor. It is only the interest cost. So there's no other major budgetary implication for the treasuries, and that's an easy way to get these governments perhaps to agree. Because otherwise, the entire amount would have a budgetary implication, and that would lead to, this is really why it is underfunded at the moment. So it is really just a question of persuading them. It's not that these governments don't have the money. It is a question of the fact that the fiscal cost right now of transferring some of these and enabling the WHO's accelerator to be functional is very, very low in terms of fiscal cost. The other uses, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust has been mentioned repeatedly. I would just like to mention that, yes, it has provided much needed liquidity at a crucial time. Unfortunately, this lending is still conditional. What we know of the conditionalities during the pandemic year is that they have still, unfortunately, emphasized fiscal restraint, very unequal value-added tax and regressive taxation systems, and cutting down on various kinds of essential expenditure. And so I'm a little opposed to any putting more money into trusts or IMF systems that continue to insist on conditionality. And We know that Kristalina Georgieva and Gita Gopinath have made excellent statements about how we should not have this kind of conditionality in the crisis. This has not reached down to the ground, and it has not reached out into either programming or the funding mechanisms, including the PRTT. So I think there's a real concern there. Whatever reallocation mechanisms we think of have got to be non-conditional. There is a serious issue about the use for global public goods, and I think that is absolutely essential over time, because we will need to keep increasing SDR allocations. This is, as everyone has mentioned, this is very little relative to the needs. There should be, I believe, automatic mechanisms within the IMF, which need to be worked out, of course, to keep increasing SDR allocations over time, and to think of reasonable, feasible ways of reallocating them. For example, for global public goods. Today, we're thinking of the pandemic. Climate change is another huge area where international cooperation is essential and inevitable. And we would have to think of how we will have funds that can fund the multilateral development banks, the regional development banks, as have already been mentioned, but also of different kinds of cross-border public investments that are necessary in order to ensure some degree of economic and social resilience. And of course, climate mitigation and climate adaptation measures. So we will need to think of trusts, but they cannot be based on this on-lending system that is necessarily conditional at the moment. We have to think of a slightly more, shall we say, flexible way, which is more responsive to the immediate and urgent needs. I'm also a little wary of using on-lending to finance something like the LSF for Africa, which has been suggested, I think, by both Vera Songwe and Daouda Sembene. Yes, the idea is certainly good to leverage the existing resources for additional money, but there are a number of concerns with the way that this has been designed. It will be pro-cyclical, it will be extremely dependent on market behavior at particular times, and will add to the kinds of cyclicality that we are seeing in the markets. It will lead to a loss of domestic monetary policy autonomy and restraints on fiscal autonomy, as we have seen because of the way capital markets respond. So there are macro financial risks and development impact. But also, if I can just emphasize that Africa must learn from the experience of middle-income countries in Asia that have experienced net losses because of this greater engagement with private bond markets, because of the fact that rates of return are so different and the rate are much higher in the middle-income countries than they are now in the advanced economies, and because we open up the capital markets to allow for this kind of free flow, simply to encourage the bond markets. Middle-income countries in Asia are losing. They are net losers from this opening up of the bond markets and the greater integration and reliance on private bond markets. We are not gaining resources in the net, we are losing them. And I think that's an important message to remember when we think of how we can recycle SDRs. We need to think, final point, I'm sorry, we will need to think of ways in which this can be a public allocation that defends the public interest and meets public purposes, which means we really should think of non-market mechanisms that can ensure that this access to liquidity is actually used for the benefit of social imperatives. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jayati, and also thanks for the important reminders about being able to move forward mechanisms free of conditionality, as well as ensuring that we're actually looking at structural shifts to the financial system and not only just some immediate fixes. There's no need to be sorry. I mean, we are so grateful to the panelists. It's clear today that we really needed a day-long seminar with you, but since you all are the busiest people in the world, that would not have been possible, but we greatly appreciate how in-depth you all went and all gave separate and distinct information today to the more than 500 people who have registered and are viewing. We are very grateful that our panelists have stayed on longer. Again, we have 42 questions. If we were to get into all those questions, we would be together another 4 or 5 hours, but we will close the event in 5 minutes. We would like to ask each of the speakers to turn on their cameras. and invite about a 1 minute, 45-second closing comment. Feel free to respond to any of the questions that you would like. If people have additional questions after the event, you can email those questions to operations@jubileeusa.org or latindad@latindad.org, and we will respond to those questions as we can. The questions generally have all fallen into: how can SDRs help with the fiscal front? What's the best way to pursue ambitious and rapid recycling? And how do we ensure SDR allocations support public services and get to the people that need it most? So let us begin for a closing comment with Vera, and then we'll just go through the line. Thank you again to all the panelists for making so much time to be with us. Vera?
Thank you, thank you. We don't have enough time, but I would like to take on Jayati and her objection to the LSF, and to say that people like Lipton and Ben Bernanke and Mark Carney support the idea. It is actually not counter-cyclical. It is a 13 trillion market in the United States. There is a liquidity premium on access to markets for developing countries. It is 150 billion that we buy in bonds from the developed markets. This is not wishing it away. This is saying if we're going to continue to make markets work, then we should correct distortions. This is not about counter-cyclicality. And yes, eventually we need to develop local currency markets, but there is a process. Today, we are borrowing from our local currency markets, but because we have not deepened our capital markets, we are still borrowing at 17% interest rates, when interest rates in the West are at negative interest rates in Japan and in the United States. So I think that I would be very happy to have further discussions with you about this, but this is really about correcting market distortions, and we need to be really clear about it. It is also about asking to level the playing field. Africa is not, and actually it's not just Africa, it's Latin America. We've been talking with the Inter-American Development Bank, and we've been talking with Southeast Asian economies. So the LSF is not an African facility, it's actually a middle income facility for everybody. And we can sort of, I think, continue this conversation. But this is an important correction that I wanted to get out to the many people, that unless there is any misunderstanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera, for your comment. Jose Antonio.
Thank you very much. Let me emphasize again that the SDRs could only be used in practice to lend them to low and middle income countries at low interest rates. And I underscore the point by Jayati that should be unconditional, not subject to conditionality. The PRGT is subject to conditionality, so it's not the best way to channel the funds. But also, and perhaps underscore this to Anna, we have to think about changing this mechanism, which is the most, as I have written, the most underutilized instrument of international cooperation. Because 85% of the SDRs are totally just accounting points in the IMF. They're nothing else than that. So there has to be a mechanism, and eliminating the dual accounting, changing the distribution formula, and eventually allow for private use are the three proposals that could be analyzed. In my view, the first one is the most important. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. Daouda.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. At this stage, I want to thank you again for the invitation. What I would want to say in conclusion is, of course, trying to respond to the question of whether SDR can play a role in a global crisis response and recovery. I think we have to put things into context. If well calibrated and timely, SDR can be instrumental in providing additional liquidity needed to help overcome the economic crisis and also bolster recovery. That said, SDR have not traditionally played this role. If you look at the proposed issuance in proportion of the global economy, that's very negligible. So you cannot actually portray SDR as being actually what is needed to really solve the global crisis response. But SDRs allocations are a big deal for developing countries. they provide actually quite a very timely and helpful liquidities that they might need to at this stage to actually help to overcome the crisis. So the question is how we should be maximizing the impact of the SDR allocations and also the reallocation. I think that's the matters, and all options should be on the table. Finally, what I would want to say is, of course, SDR are not the panacea. I think Esteban has said that they need to be complemented by the expansion of MDB's financing. They also need to be complemented by other forms of debt relief for countries that really need it the most. And finally, of course, they need to be completed by a bigger role for the private sector. And ultimately, if we want to actually recover African economies and also economies of developing countries in general, this is the way to go in order over the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Daouda. Anna.
There's lots of questions, but I want to try to be very brief. First, on many technical questions on the chat, you can find the majority of the answers in our website. There's a very useful SDR fact sheet, as well as a question and answer, frequent questions and answers. Many of those answers are already posted there. Second, on a very important issue, as I said, the SDRs are an unconditional reserve assets. They are booked with the members, not with the IMF. They're not in some accounting mechanism in the IMF. They are on the balance sheet of central banks. And how countries use them is to their best judgment. What we can do as an institution and in cooperation with all of you is advise countries on how to use them transparently and for recovery and long-term resilience. But it is really up to the members how they will utilize the SDR allocation. Finally, I want to associate myself with many of the statements on what it will take to help vulnerable countries really overcome the pandemic and recover. It takes much more than the SDR general allocation. If you look at our study on external financing needs for low-income countries, it clearly calls for a comprehensive and holistic approach to meet those needs. The SDR allocation is one speedy instrument that we have available, and we're hoping to use it, but there's also need to catalyze private investment, to do domestic reforms, and to mobilize grants and more concessional financing. So we really have to look at all the possible opportunities and not just about the SDR general allocation and the reallocation mechanism. So on that, I want to fully endorse other statements that have been made today. I stop here. Thank you, Eric.
Anna, thank you so much. Esteban.
Yes, three things. Number one, the proposals by the IMF was $650 billion can have an important impact in terms of increasing international reserves and in terms of buffering the external position of some of the countries of Latin America as the more vulnerable ones, and that's a very positive aspect. Number two, an SDR allocation is not enough, should be accompanied by reallocation. Reallocation should include not only low-income countries, but also middle-income countries. And number three, as I said before, SDRs has to be part of a more articulated and coherent response of the multilateral financial architecture to combat the pandemic and to build forward better. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. And finally, Jayati.
Thank you, and I will also try to be brief. Just very quickly to Vera, Vera, I do understand your point about a level playing field. It's just that the Asian experience has shown greater involvement in global capital markets has not leveled our playing field. It has actually added to our losses and foreign exchange losses because of the differential rates of return. But we can have that discussion on another occasion as well. On the lower budgetary impact, there was a question from the participants. This lower budgetary impact is because only the interest costs would be calculated in terms of this kind of new investment in the COVAX and in the ACT accelerator of WHO. That's why it would be a lower fiscal cost to get the G7 countries to put money, 10% of their SDR allocation into this. And finally, I just want to reemphasize the point made by Jose Antonio Ocampo, that yes, we are all thinking within the constraints of what is possible right now because there are immediate and urgent needs and because we're used to thinking in terms of these constraints. But ultimately, this is really no time for business as usual. And we do have to rethink both the way in which these SDRs are allocated and the different mechanisms that are available for their repurposing and recycling. So we really do have to step outside this box if we are going to do anything to combat the massive challenges that the global economy is facing today. Thanks.
Thank you, Jayati. And again, I want to thank all of our panelists as well as the 16 organizations that made today's event possible. The sharing was incredible, Rich, and I apologize that we went so long. It's very clear we need more time, especially as all of the issues that you so expertly laid out today are the very decisions being considered, accepted, and debated by world leaders. The next round of decisions on these issues will take place over the summer with an IMF vote on the $650 billion allocation. The processes for reallocation mechanisms and vehicles are also being considered right now by world leaders. And I think, as several speakers alluded to today, in terms of the years to come, the discussion both on reallocation as well as new creation of special drawing rights is going to be a continuing issue that we look at and address over a multi-year period. We realize again today that we are dealing with a crisis like no other. 495 million jobs wiped out, 95 million more people, mostly women and children, have entered the ranks of poverty, and 265 million more people face famine. We're seeing the worst crisis in many of the developed middle-income countries, which are left out at this point of a lot of the processes we've been discussing today. So as we move forward in terms of moving forward a resilient economic recovery, being able to respond to the pandemic, we realize that special drawing rights are an incredibly important part of the solution. But we also need to be looking at broader solutions in terms of the use of special drawing rights and creation in the future, new aid flows, debt relief, development, as well as being able to respond to the various shocks in this pandemic, like climate change. Again, we're so grateful to have you with us today. You can watch this video on Facebook at Latin Dad. If you have any further questions, we were not able to answer all of your questions today. Please email Jubilee USA at operations@jubileeusa.org or latindad@latindad.org. Thank you for being with us. God bless.